I want to ask, was Solomon a great man? We're a bit inclined to say no because he ended so badly, and we'll come to that next talk. But I want to show you he was a really great man, and his greatness is what made his downfall such a tragedy. Now, in Shakespearean times, it was a tragedy if the protagonist was great. Then he had a character flaw that led him to some great misdemeanor, and that led to his destruction. For example, Macbeth was a great man. I have won golden opinions from all sorts of people. But he had a character flaw, and it was ambition. It led him to kill Duncan, and that led to his great demise. By the way, Romeo and Juliet, by this definition, is not a tragedy. Romeo was not a great man. He didn't have a character flaw. He didn't commit a great misdemeanor. They were simply a young couple caught in very unfortunate circumstances. It's a very sad story, but by this definition, it's not a tragedy. Now, I want to try to dazzle you with Solomon's greatness. We're going to do a very fast scan of 9 chapters of the Bible, and I'm just going to pick out a very few things to indicate his greatness. The second last thing David said to him was, "Be strong, act like a man." David wanted his son to be a great man. Now, I tried out on the ladies of our Bible study group what they considered made a real man. And it wasn't good looks or physique, which made me a bit sad because I was a bit of a weightlifter myself in my youth. But David's definition of a man was someone who does what God requires. And Solomon did that for many years, and it was part of his greatness. Sadly, the last thing that David ever said to Solomon was, "Bring Shimei's grey head down to the grave in blood." He had a grudge against Shimei. But when Solomon came to the throne, he didn't do that. He said to Shimei, "If you will stay within the bounds of Jerusalem, I will let you live. But if you step outside the boundary, your blood be on your own head." That was already showing the grace of a great man. He gave another chance. But it also showed the wisdom. He gave a chance for Shimei to show his true colors, and he did. And it was on his own head. Then in chapter 3, that famous incident where God says to him, "Ask whatever you want and I will give it to you." My word, what would you ask for? Midas famously asked for everything he touched to turn to gold. And then he touched his beloved and she turned to gold and became worthless to him. Solomon chose a discerning heart. He asked for wisdom. And that's immediately followed by the famous story of the 2 mothers, one of whose baby had died, and they were in a great dispute over whose baby it was. And Solomon famously showed his wisdom in how he worked that out. But part of what we were not told in Sunday school was that these were 2 prostitutes. They were the dregs of society. And yet here is this great king willing to spend time on the lowest people in his community. I often think one sign of great people is how they treat little people. Then in chapter 4, we are shown the size of his empire. It stretched from Egypt right across to the Euphrates River. That's about 1,600 kilometers, 1,000 miles in width. Now that brown patch in the middle, that was David's kingdom, and that was considered great. So just look at this. And the remarkable thing is he achieved all this, although he had a great army, not by conquest, but mainly by diplomacy and negotiation. He was one of the world's great diplomats. And notice that the great trade routes of the Middle East passed through that territory, so whoever controlled those trade routes had access to great power and wealth. Then in chapter 5, we come to his workforce. Now, I'm in awe of what Solomon could do. To give you some idea, here is just a slice. These are just the people who were working on the quarries of Lebanon to cut stones for the temple. There were 7,000 carriers, 80,000 stone cutters, 3,000 foremen, 30,000 laborers. Just imagine the logistics, the training, the organization involved in keeping that going. And notice that the 30,000 worked in shifts of 10,000 a month, so that they spent 1 month in Lebanon and 2 months at home. Now that's actually very advanced labor practice. It made sure that everyone had a job, but they had time for their home, they had time for a life. In chapter 6, we see how he went about building the temple. Solomon ordered that no hammer or chisel was to be heard at the temple site while it was being built. So all blocks were dressed in the quarry. Such was Solomon's respect for the place of God. But just think about it. That meant that every block had to be cut to the millimeter so that when it was taken to the temple site, it would fit exactly and the whole structure would hold together. Just think of the training and the quality control in achieving that. We read that he lined its interior walls with cedar paneling from floor to ceiling and covered the floor with planks of juniper. I think the best wood paneling I've ever seen in a building was actually the First Presbyterian Church in Derry in Ireland. Magnificent, but nothing compared to Solomon's temple. And then incredibly we read, he covered the inner court with pure gold from floor to ceiling, including the floors and the ceiling. It was one of the wonders of the ancient world. In chapter 8, he brings the ark into the temple. Now David had brought the ark to Jerusalem. He now brings it into the temple. But he observes exactly what the laws of Moses required for the moving of the ark and the setting up of that temple, so that he never had the trouble David had. And God was so pleased that the glory of the Lord filled the temple. The priests had to leave. They could not perform their service. Now, this only happened twice in the Old Testament. Now, at the inauguration of Solomon's temple, and in the book of Exodus, at the inauguration of the tabernacle under Moses. Solomon is paired with the great Moses. By the way, this incident also took place once in the New Testament. On the day of Pentecost, God sent his glory, the pillar of fire, down, not on the upper room, but on the heads of the people sitting there, that we are filled with the glory of God. Just think about that. And then Solomon spread his hands towards heaven and said, Lord God of Israel, there is no God like you in heaven above or on earth beneath. And he goes on for 40 verses with this great prayer. Firstly, he shows what a magnificent orator he was, but he also shows his theology. He's a theologian, and he shows his great respect for God. And when it was over, the people blessed the king and went home, prosperous, joyful, and glad in heart. Isn't that what a statesman's job is to do? Is to make his people prosperous. There was no poverty in Israel, and everybody was happy. Oh, that God would give us leaders like that. And then in chapter 10, we get a survey of his wealth. I'm just going to pick out a couple of things from this vast array. Solomon received over 20,000 kilograms of gold every year. I looked it up, and that is about $288 million worth. I don't even know what that means. And then we're told that he had fleets of ships, ivory and spices such as had never been seen before, apes, 12,000 horses, 1,400 chariots. We'll come back to them next week. All of the utensils in his palace, including the kitchen equipment, was made of pure gold. And then we come to this fascinating sentence, silver was not considered of much value in Solomon's time. Untold wealth. But most importantly, his wisdom. We read, Solomon was greater in wisdom than all the other kings of the earth, and people came from all over the known world to get his advice on how to run their country. But it wasn't just his wisdom as such, it was his knowledge. He was an authority on plants, animals, birds, reptiles, and fish. Apart from being a statesman, soldier, architect, administrator, diplomat, and poet, he was a botanist, zoologist, ornithologist, ichthyologist, and a herpetologist. The only other person I can think of that comes close to this is our own Jan Smuts, whom I consider to be one of the two great people this country has produced. Not only a great soldier statesman, he was also considered an authority on a host of subjects. One night during a war situation, they came up to him and found him lying by the campfire, reading a book, would you believe, on the moral effects of the prohibition of vodka in Russia. A great man improving his great mind. By any measure, Solomon was a great man, and I can only stand in awe and gratitude of a God who can create a human being like that.